Horror games are something very different and strange when compared to most other games. The idea of fun does not always come from being easy or joyous. It usually comes from pain, struggling, and frustration. And just like video games as a whole, the same kind of contrast exists in the aspects of horror. The setting of a video game is that contrasting concept that stands alone and is the first layer that stands on top of the foundation of pillars from our last episode. This will be the final piece that holds up the rest of the aspects waiting for us in the future. While you always are experiencing the setting of a game, most times it falls into the background while giving a platform for the other aspects to shine and take the attention of the player. It also tends to work strongly in conjunction with presentation, which we covered before, to really put together a tone and pull the player into the games itself. The setting is comprised of things that we reduce to who, where, and when done correctly, it should help the player understand the what and the why of the video game itself. Obviously, some games do thrive on making sure that some of these questions aren't clear, but those are the exception to the rule rather than the rule itself. So I think the best place to jump into the setting is to start with the who. A game's world is very reliant on the characters that are within it. The recent release and controversies that have followed Bethesda's Fallout 76 have been proof of this, as one of the major complaints is the empty game world, being described as an ocean as deep as a puddle because of the ill-fated decision to try to make players act as NPCs, making the game seem like work rather than leisure. This, in fact, ended up creating a very lonely world. Now, this does not mean, though, that worlds that are lonely lack life and are necessarily bad, but in this case, it was discouraged upon. Many horror games use this concept of isolation within their setting to help the game's tone. A good example of this would actually use the word isolation in the title, and that would be Alien Isolation. The game starts with you alone with no allies to help you. Over time you will find some people while exploring, but even then you are truly alone and isolated, trying to survive this crazy game of cat and mouse as you are chased throughout this very isolated, dark corridors of this spaceship. This use of isolation, though, is not the only way to help bring a player in and make them uncomfortable. Games like Telltale's Walking Dead show more of the human side of horrors, leaving the zombies themselves as minor characters. Vampyr also does this very well, using multitudes of people to help experience the horrors of what your actions are doing. Due to the actions that you take throughout the game and the decision that you make, certain things and the actions of other characters without the game are going to change. You'll find that characters will make decisions based off of losing loved ones and things of that nature, which you end up playing a direct role with. This makes the city feel more alive and actually makes the setting even stronger, because not only are you actually living within this growing living world, but you're also seeing how it affects the people around you. And as time goes on, those decisions that people are making will actually make visible effects on the city itself. And if you actually cause enough chaos and do enough things, the city itself will actually be taken over by monsters. And this means that you'll actually be able to have a gameplay difference because of the decisions that you have made throughout the game. When we look at the who of a setting, though, not only do NPCs play a role, the enemies you might meet and have to play with do so also. Some games choose to have enemies that are just aggressive and vicious animals or creatures which have no ability to do anything more but be aggressors themselves. Sometimes these aggressors will let out tidbits of dialogue as you play, making them a bit more personable, but a lot of times this is something that is just used to ramp up the intensity, like in games like Outlast, where you're being chased by people who are speaking to you, or if you're going through and you're playing games like Amnesia, where you can hear the water sloshing as you have the water monster chasing you. These characters are usually given some kind of backstory or explanation through some kind of exposition or hints throughout the game. Resident Evil does this very well, as you pick up notes filling in the blanks about the experiments around you and how these enemies have come to be, what they're based off of, and things of that nature. Yet other games like Evil Within do not give you much of an explanation on the enemies themselves, leaving a lot of it to be unknown as you try to fill out this information as you realize what the reality is around you and how much it's being bent by the will of the enemies within it. After you figure out who you're dealing with, or not for the most part, you have to figure out where you are. The where can be just as important as the who, but has become pretty predictable and downright toxic. Horror games tend to fall into similar tropes. A lot of these are misinformed and lead to misunderstandings about certain things like mental health and other tragedies like struggling with amnesia and personal trauma. These tropes have found a living embodiment a lot of times through parts of the setting, sometimes very simply and sometimes very complexly, depending on what you're looking at. The setting of a hospital or an asylum, maybe even a church or a mansion, is very common within horror games. Almost every game that we have mentioned so far actually does cover one of these tropes, as you find yourself in one of these situations throughout the game or another. These locations do invoke scares naturally to the audience, but a lot of that comes down to the stigmas that are created from things like this, creating this never-ending cycle of what is remembered and what keeps getting pushed along. A lot of times these stigmas are actually feeding the horror itself rather than creating it, and because they keep getting brought up over and over again, they become more and more believed by others, and that creates this more of a stigma, and it keeps going in this like cycle, and it's very destructive to those who are actually struggling with these issues. There are games though that do break the norm, like Dead Island, which is located on an island resort and is brightly lit, truly contrasting a lot of the tones that you find in horror games around you. There is also Resistance Fallen Man, which actually uses a combination of open streets and very tight tunnels to really give you this sense of imposingness. A lot of times the enemies are very strong and powerful, so you find yourself in the open, and you find yourself actually being more intimidated by these large open areas because there isn't anywhere to hide. Another example of this, if you go back to Dead Island, is that the game uses a lot of vegetation and then will also use patio furniture to obscure your view. This creates a strong anticipation because you find yourself hearing zombies and hearing enemies long before you actually see them. But it also does create these jump scares that can be frustrating, but a lot of times feel a lot more natural than something that is a little more scripted, like a game Until Dawn would use. A good thing about this is that Dead Island's actually using its setting to actually work in its favor. By being able to have justifiable things like vegetation in a tropical landscape and using patio furniture for a resort, you find yourself not questioning why the environment is built this way and more finding yourself immersed in the game. And then going back to Resistance, it'll use a lot of varied arenas to try to keep you on your toes as you find yourself going through and fighting enemies who actually will begin to have weapons that shoot through cover itself, making it so that these infested areas actually are more intimidating because not only are you trying to hide from those in cover, but you also have to find this very quick, frantic hustle from cover to cover to try to avoid being shot by weapons who actually are digging through your cover itself. Another game that uses tunnels very strongly is the Metro series, where you find yourself running through these tunnels that are actually real-life tunnels in Russia. This inclusion is actually very immersive as you find yourself thinking about how more realistic this could be because of the fact that you are playing in a place that is based in reality. You find yourself wondering if this could really happen, as in the Cold War time, these kind of situations are something that people were actually preparing for on a normal basis because we didn't know what was going to happen. So the idea of nuclear war and then nuclear winter creating this very horrifying scenario where people are living underground because the surface itself is so dangerous is something that you find yourself wondering about, because the where in this situation, the setting in this situation, is actually something that is hinged on real non-fiction, making this fictional story have so much more weight. So finally though, when you start looking into setting a video game, you have to look at the when. The actual date and time that the game is placed dictates many of the things that are played, like the narrative itself and a lot of the other situations that play within the game. The concept of when actually makes you have to consider a lot of these things when you're making decisions about how you would tell your story and if the story tends to be cohesive. If you're going for realism, the actual date being used can dictate if certain items are actually going to be able to be included or not. A game like Vampyr, where the setting is after the First World War, would be hurt by the inclusion of something like a modern car or the inclusion of a cell phone. But on the same hand, the inclusion of the Spanish flu, an epidemic that was actually running rampant during this time, really helps construct a story that felt more compelling, and because it was rooted in history, just like how Metro was rooted in actual physical places, you find that the story itself gets lifted by this strong concept that is hinged in real reality. Yet, as something as important as when doesn't necessarily have to be based in reality. Games like Dead Space, Soma, and Alien Isolation use a future setting to tell their stories. The technology used within the games are actually more of a science fiction and are dictated by futuristic settings, something that we actually haven't seen before. But then there are games like Bioshock and Resistance and then Layers of Fear, who's used settings in the past, but that are also kind of consistent on things that aren't in reality. Like in Bioshock, you have this underwater city, but you have a lot of these 1950 aspects, like the 1950s music, the 1950s kind of like lifestyle thoughts, with communism being a strong aspect, as Andrew Ryan is talking about it during the game. This base in a reality that is in the past, but then using futuristic science fiction at the same time, you find yourself questioning, but because of the way that the rest of the setting is made, because Rapture is such a cohesive city, showing a lot of these concepts that would still be around at this time, you find yourself very immersed, and it creates this very strong story to be told, because you're not sitting there in disbelief of this city, but more in awe of the city itself. In combination, these three parts, the who, the where, and the when, come together to create the setting itself, as it puts together the final part of the story foundation, and the rest of the series will then be built upon this. The setting plays a role as is the first real connection from the game function to the game story. It begins to put together characters, the places, and the times to be created, and it helps you try to create this experience that you're lost in. The process is actually known as immersion, and we'll be covering that later in the series. After setting up all the foundation of the horror games itself, we'll be going into the story aspects next week. We'll be going through and trying to cover different kind of concepts, the storytelling ways that are done, and how each different way can be successful, and what they are doing to actually make it successful. So, see you then.